He was lying in that hospital bed, barely able to move, his skin pale as winter frost, and she held his hand like it was the last thing tethering him to this world. The machines beeped in rhythm with his fading heartbeat, and outside the room, vultures in tailored suits whispered about inheritances and wills. But Grace? She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. What she didn't know was that the man she was crying for wasn't dying at all. He was watching, testing, waiting to see if anyone in his cold, glittering world actually gave a damn about him as a human being, not just a bank account. And what he discovered in those agonizing days would shatter everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and the price of trust. Because sometimes the people we underestimate are the only ones who see us for who we really are. And sometimes, by the time we realize that, it's already too late. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Richard Montgomery Cole, a man who built an empire from nothing and lost his soul somewhere along the way. By the time he turned 63, Richard had accumulated more wealth than most small nations. He owned hotels in Dubai, tech startups in Silicon Valley, and enough real estate to house half of Manhattan. But wealth has a way of isolating you. It builds walls higher than any mansion gate. And Richard had been living behind those walls for so long, he forgot what it felt like to be seen as anything other than a walking dollar sign. His wife had passed away 7 years earlier, a quiet woman who'd loved him when he was nobody, back when his office was a cramped studio apartment and his business cards were printed at the local library. After she died, something in Richard died too. He stopped trusting people. Every smile seemed fake. Every compliment felt like a transaction. His own children visited twice a year, always with their hands out, always with some new crisis that required a check with several zeros. His business partners smiled to his face and schemed behind his back. Even his closest friends, the ones he'd known for decades, had a way of disappearing when the investments went south. So Richard did what any man drowning in suspicion would do. He withdrew. He became colder, meaner. He tested people in small, cruel ways, watching them fail over and over again. And then one day, sitting in his study overlooking the manicured gardens of his Connecticut estate, he had an idea. A test. The ultimate test. He would fake a terminal illness and see who stayed, who cared, who mourned, and who started counting his money before his body was even cold. But to understand why this test mattered so much, you have to understand Grace Holloway. Grace was 42 years old, a widow who'd lost her husband to a construction accident 3 years prior. She had a son, 17-year-old Daniel, who was brilliant, kind, and desperate to go to college, but they couldn't afford it. Grace worked as Richard's housekeeper, a job she'd taken out of necessity, not ambition. She wasn't trying to climb any social ladder, she just needed to survive. Every morning she arrived at the estate at 6, made Richard's coffee the way he liked it, black with 1 sugar, and set it on the table in his study before he even woke up. She cleaned the 14-bedroom mansion with a quiet efficiency, never complaining, never asking for anything beyond her modest salary. Richard barely noticed her. To him, she was part of the furniture, a shadow that moved through the halls, keeping his world tidy. But Grace noticed him. She saw the way he stared out the window for hours, the way he flinched when his daughter called, the way he ate dinner alone every single night in a dining room built for 20. She saw the loneliness that money couldn't fix. And though she never said it out loud, she felt sorry for him. Not because he was poor, but because he was empty. One evening in late September, Richard made the call. He contacted his personal physician, Dr. Andrew Kellerman, a man he'd known for 30 years and trusted as much as he trusted anyone. Richard laid out the plan with the precision of a military operation. He would fake a heart condition, something serious but vague enough to be believable. Dr. Kellerman would confirm the diagnosis. Richard would play the part of a dying man, and everyone around him would reveal their true nature. The doctor hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the deception, but Richard was persuasive. He always was. He framed it as a psychological experiment, a way to protect himself from vultures, a final act of due diligence before deciding who deserved his fortune. Dr. Kellerman agreed, but only on one condition. If Richard's health actually declined, if the stress triggered a real medical event, the experiment would end immediately. Richard agreed. He didn't think it would come to that. He thought he was in control. He thought he could manipulate the outcome, predict every move, calculate every reaction. But life has a way of humbling men who think they're gods. The collapse happened on a Tuesday morning, just after breakfast. Richard had been sitting at the dining table, reading the financial section of the newspaper, when he suddenly clutched his chest and fell forward, knocking over his coffee. Grace was in the kitchen when she heard the crash. She ran into the dining room and found him on the floor, gasping, his face twisted in pain. She screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands to his chest, begging him to stay with her. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived. Dr. Kellerman was already there, playing his role perfectly, shouting medical jargon, checking vitals, looking grave. They loaded Richard onto a stretcher and rushed him to the private wing of St. Catherine's Hospital, a place where the wealthy went to suffer in luxury. Grace rode in the ambulance, holding Richard's hand the entire way, whispering prayers under her breath. She didn't think about her job. She didn't think about her paycheck. She just thought about the man who'd given her a chance when no one else would, the man who was now slipping away in front of her eyes. At the hospital, the news spread fast. Richard's daughter, Melissa, arrived within hours, her designer heels clicking against the polished floors, her face a mask of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. His son, Trevor, flew in from Los Angeles the next day, his wife in tow, both of them already whispering about estate lawyers and offshore accounts. Richard's business partners sent flowers and cards, their messages dripping with false sympathy. But Grace? Grace never left. She slept in a chair beside his bed, surviving on hospital coffee and vending machine crackers. She read to him from the Bible, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. She wiped his forehead with a damp cloth when he sweated through the night. And when the doctors, following Richard's script, announced that he had only weeks to live, Grace broke down in the hallway, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Richard, lying in that bed, his eyes half closed, heard everything. He saw everything, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than suspicion. He felt shame. The performance continued for days. Richard played his part flawlessly, his voice weak, his movements slow, his face a portrait of resignation. Melissa and Trevor visited in shifts, their conversations always circling back to the will, the estate, the foundation, the assets. They spoke in hushed tones just outside his room, thinking he couldn't hear, but he could. Every word, every calculation, every lie wrapped in concern. They asked Dr. Kellerman pointed questions about timelines and mental competency, their eyes hungry, their patience thin. Meanwhile, Grace sat by Richard's side, holding his hand, telling him stories about her son, about the life she dreamed of giving him, about the small miracles that kept her going. She never asked for anything, not once. And that's when Richard realized something that gutted him. The only person in his life who truly cared whether he lived or died was the one person he'd never really seen. But then, one night, Richard overheard something that sent a chill down his spine. It was late, past midnight, and Grace was standing in the hallway just outside his room, talking on her phone. Her voice was low, trembling, and Richard strained to hear. "I can't keep this secret anymore," she whispered. "It's eating me alive. I have to tell someone. I have to do the right thing." Richard's heart, the one he'd been pretending was failing, actually skipped a beat. His mind raced. Was she talking about him? Had she figured out the test? Was she planning to sell the story to the media, to expose him, to cash in on his vulnerability? Every ounce of trust he'd been building crumbled in an instant. He felt the old suspicion flood back, cold and familiar. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but he couldn't, not without breaking the illusion. So he waited. And the next morning, he made a decision that would change everything. He decided to take the test one step further. He decided to die. Dr. Kellerman was furious when Richard told him the plan. "You're going too far," the doctor hissed in the privacy of Richard's hospital room. "This isn't a game anymore. You're playing with people's emotions. You're playing with Grace's heart." But Richard was resolute. He needed to know. He needed to see what Grace would do when she thought he was gone, when there was no reward, no paycheck, no audience. So they staged it. Early one morning, Dr. Kellerman walked into the waiting room, where Grace had been sleeping, and delivered the news with a heavy voice. "He's gone. I'm so sorry." Grace's scream echoed through the hospital. She collapsed, her body shaking with sobs, and the nurses had to help her to a chair. She refused to leave. She sat outside his room for hours, staring at the door, as if willing him to walk back through it. When they finally let her see the body, she stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "Thank you for everything. I hope you're at peace now." Richard, watching through a hidden camera feed from a nearby room, felt his chest tighten. Not from a fake heart condition, from guilt. From the crushing realization that he'd been so consumed by his need for control, so obsessed with proving that people were rotten, that he'd tortured the one person who deserved none of it. But he couldn't stop now. The test wasn't over. He needed to see what happened next. And what happened next nearly destroyed him. Grace went back to the estate, alone, and began cleaning. Not because she was still employed. The family had already told her they didn't need her services anymore, but because she wanted the house to be perfect for Richard's memorial. She spent hours polishing the floors, arranging flowers, setting up chairs in the garden for the service. She used her own money to buy candles and a guest book. She did all of this while grieving, while exhausted, while the family she'd served argued over assets in the very rooms she was cleaning. And when Melissa snapped at her, told her she was just the help and had no place organizing anything, Grace simply nodded and kept working. Meanwhile, Richard's lawyers began the process of reading the will, and that's when the feeding frenzy truly began. Melissa and Trevor fought over every clause, every asset, every piece of art and stock option. They accused each other of manipulation, of being the favorite, of scheming with their father behind the other's back. Business partners started calling, reminding everyone of debts and promises and handshake deals that conveniently had no paper trail. Old friends emerged from the woodwork, suddenly remembering loans that Richard supposedly owed them. It was a circus, a grotesque display of human greed. And through it all, Grace stayed quiet. She attended the memorial service, standing in the back, her face swollen from crying, and then she disappeared. No one noticed. No one cared. Richard, still hidden, still watching, felt a rage he hadn't felt in decades, not at Grace, at himself, at the world he'd built, at the people he'd surrounded himself with. But he still had one more piece of the puzzle to uncover, because late one night, 3 days after his supposed death, Richard's head of security brought him a recording, a phone call Grace had made, the one he'd overheard, the one that made him doubt her. And when he listened to the full conversation, Richard Montgomery Cole, billionaire, cynic, architect of his own isolation, broke down and wept. Grace hadn't been talking about him at all. She'd been talking about her son. Daniel had been offered a scholarship to a prestigious university, but it required a reference letter from someone of standing, someone who could vouch for his character. Grace had been too proud to ask Richard while he was alive. She'd been too afraid of overstepping, of seeming opportunistic. So she'd called her pastor, asking if he could write the letter instead, and confessing how guilty she felt for not asking Richard, for keeping the opportunity a secret, for worrying that she'd miss her chance to give her son a better life. That was the secret she couldn't keep. Not some betrayal, not some scheme. Just the quiet heartbreak of a mother who wanted to do right by her child. Richard sat alone in that dark room, the recording playing on a loop, and he realized something that shattered the last piece of armor around his heart. Grace had never needed to pass his test. He was the one who'd been failing hers all along. The next morning, Richard Montgomery Cole walked through the front door of his estate. Alive, healthy, very much not dead. The staff screamed. Melissa dropped her phone. Trevor actually stumbled backward, his face pale. But Richard didn't care about any of them. He walked straight through the house, past the relatives scrambling for explanations, past the lawyers shouting about legality and ethics, and he found Grace in the garden, kneeling by the flower beds, planting roses. She looked up, saw him, and froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, Richard said, "I need to tell you the truth." And he did. He told her everything, the fake illness, the test, the cameras, the suspicion, the paranoia, the desperate need to know if anyone in his life was real. He told her about the phone call he'd misunderstood, about the shame that had been eating him alive, about the fact that she, a woman he'd barely acknowledged, had shown him more humanity in 2 weeks than his own family had in 2 decades. Grace listened, her face unreadable, and when he finished, she stood, brushed the dirt off her knees, and looked him in the eye. "You didn't have to test me," she said softly. "You just had to ask." Richard expected anger. He expected her to walk away, to curse him, to demand justice. But Grace just sighed, a deep, weary sigh, and said, "I hope you found what you were looking for, Mr. Cole, I really do." And then she turned to leave. But Richard stopped her. "Wait, please." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is a reference letter. For Daniel. And this," he pulled out another envelope, "is a check for his full tuition. 4 years, plus living expenses, plus whatever he needs to chase every dream he's ever had." Grace stared at the envelopes, her hands trembling. "I can't accept this." "You already earned it," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You earned it every day you showed up, every night you stayed, every moment you treated me like a person, not a paycheck. Please, let me do this one decent thing." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she took the envelopes, pressing them to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, because Grace was Grace, she added, "But you have to promise me something. Anything. Stop testing people. Start trusting them. Life's too short for all this suspicion." Richard nodded, unable to speak, and Grace walked away, back to her son, back to her life, leaving Richard standing alone in the garden he'd built but never really seen. But this story doesn't end there, because 3 months later, Richard Montgomery Cole collapsed again. This time, it wasn't a test. It was real. A massive heart attack, sudden and brutal, and by the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. He died on the way to the hospital, the same route he'd faked months earlier, and this time there were no cameras, no scripts, no hidden agendas. Just a man. Alone. His final thoughts a mystery. The will was read 2 weeks later, and it shocked everyone. Richard had rewritten it the day after his confrontation with Grace. He left his daughter and son a modest trust, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly, with a note that said, "Earn the rest." He left his business empire to a team of managers with strict instructions to donate 70% of profits to charity, and he left Grace half of his personal estate, including the mansion, with one condition, that she turn it into a foundation for single mothers and their children, a place where people like her could find support, education, and hope. The family contested it, of course. They fought and screamed and hired lawyers, but the will was ironclad. Richard had made sure of that. And Grace, after months of legal battles and sleepless nights, won. She kept her promise. She turned that cold, lonely mansion into a home filled with laughter, learning, and second chances. And every year, on the anniversary of Richard's death, She plants roses in the garden, the same ones she was planting the day he came back from the dead, and she whispers a prayer. Not for his money, not for his legacy, but for the man he became in those final months. The man who learned, just in time, that the greatest wealth isn't what you own. It's who stays when you have nothing left to give. So I want to ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. If you were in Richard's position, would you have done the same thing? Would you test the people closest to you, or would you choose to trust them, even if it meant getting hurt? And if you were Grace, would you have forgiven him? Would you have accepted his apology, his money, his attempt at redemption? Or would you have walked away and never looked back? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Because stories like this, they're not just about other people, they're mirrors. They show us who we are when no one's watching. They ask us what we value, who we trust, and what we'd do if we had the power to test the people we love. And sometimes the answers scare us. Sometimes they change us. Richard spent his whole life building walls, and it took a woman he barely noticed to show him that walls don't protect you, they just keep you alone. Grace spent her whole life giving, and it took a man who tested her to show her that her kindness wasn't weakness, it was power. And in the end, that power outlived him. It outlasted his empire. It turned a monument to loneliness into a sanctuary of hope. That's the real test. Not whether people stay when you're dying, but whether you're the kind of person worth staying for, and if you're not, whether you're brave enough to change before it's too late. Richard almost ran out of time. He almost died, twice, without ever really living. But Grace gave him a third chance, not because he deserved it, but because that's who she was. And maybe that's the lesson. Maybe the people we underestimate, the ones we take for granted, the ones we barely see, they're the ones holding the keys to everything we're searching for. And maybe, just maybe, if we stopped testing them and started seeing them, we'd realize we already have everything we need. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something real, do me a favor. Share it. Not for me. For the next person who needs to hear it. For the next Richard who's building walls. For the next Grace who's wondering if anyone sees her. And subscribe, because the next story I'm bringing you is going to challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, family, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for being here. Thanks for staying. And remember, the greatest test isn't whether people pass yours, it's whether you pass theirs. I'll see you in the next one.